Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. We're all experiencing stress, exhaustion, anxiety, and even grief as a result of the global pandemic. For the nonprofit sector in particular, it's a challenging time. Nearly 2 years into the pandemic, the nonprofit sector is experiencing the Great Resignation, with mental health and burnout leading to people exiting their jobs. What is the extent of the problem, and what are the solutions? Joining me today to discuss the issue is Pamela Uppal, Policy Advisor at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, leading its Future of Work file with a nonprofit and gender-based intersectional lens, alongside the Decent Work for Women project. Welcome, Pam.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you just briefly describe what ONN is and its role in the sector?
For sure. So the Ontario Nonprofit Network is an independent nonprofit network. We have a reach about 20,000 across the province for the 55,000 nonprofits and charities in Ontario. We primarily focus on policy advocacy and services to strengthen Ontario's nonprofit sector as a key pillar of our society and economy. And so what I mean by that is we're not direct service delivery. We're sort of one step removed, and we're really in that middle space, sort of, monitoring what kind of public policy is impacting the sector. So really hearing from the sector in any way that we can, and convening and bringing those voices together, and then channeling those voices to government and other key stakeholders, and vice versa. Any public policy issues that are coming down, legislation coming down from both provincial and federal government, will sort of do the analysis, the dissemination to our sector as well. We work in three big buckets. The bucket that I lead is our people. So as you were mentioning, that includes decent work, care economy, and the future of work. So all those, big meaty issues that are impacting our labor force. And then the other two are financing and regulatory buckets. So financing, how we receive our money, but also how nonprofits build inclusive local economies. And then regulatory environments, pretty self-explanatory, the way in which our sector is or isn't regulated.
Well, that's a huge portfolio that you have, but I think one of the things is it gave you a really good lens on what was going on when the pandemic hit Canada in the early 2020. It was clear that the nonprofit sector was particularly hard hit, with the organizations and professionals being uniquely vulnerable. Can you give us an overview of the landscape at the time and the impact on the labor force as you learned?
Chaotic, if I can use one word to describe it, right? It was just, I remember March 15th getting that email from work being like, hey, we're going to shut down for 2 weeks to be in line with school, right? And at that point, no one knew 2 weeks was going to turn out to be, like a year and a half, and God forbid if it's like 2 years at some point, right? And so I would describe the immediate reaction of the sector as chaotic. Whenever has our, total sector, not just across the province, but across the country, had to shut down and move to online in some way, right? So definitely chaotic, and definitely, I would say pivot was the word of the moment. As, nonprofits were assessing, okay, what do we shut down? What can we do from home? And what can we not do from home at all? There's a lot of pivoting happening. And that's what I find so interesting about our sector, is that it's so diverse. We have the essential workers in our sector, a lot of those spaces that didn't shut down: childcare, home care, long-term care, personal support workers, shelters, developmental disability services, all of that. They were considered essential workers, so work as usual, right? And then we had those other sort of services that you didn't need to be in person to do, but definitely had a client sort of focus. So whether it's immigrant and settlement, employment and training, any other sort of wraparound support services that don't necessarily require that in-person counseling, family services, that sort of stuff. So those were the ones who are like, okay, really trying to pick up and move online, and really accelerating digitization of the sector almost that was so unanticipated. And then we had a part of the sector, I would say was particularly hit, and especially the workers in those subsectors: arts and culture industries, our sports and recreation industries, our faith-based spaces were all shut down, not considered essential services. And how do you, at that point, thinking about how do you move a theater production online, right? Or how do you move, faith-based spaces and convenings and all of that to online spaces? How do you do a soccer game online? You can't, right? So definitely sort of thinking about the sector in those three ways, and the labor force the labor force in all those three spaces. And I think the other sort of, as we were pivoting, it was like, okay, we can do this. We can sort of pivot. We were expecting support, whether that's from provincial or federal government, as those announcements were coming down. And I know we'll talk about that a bit shortly, but that definitely had an impact on what happened to the sector and how the workforce sort of pivoted and sort of, stuck around. And I think the other piece that I just mentioned around that is this language around essential workers, essential workplaces, care jobs, and the care economy, which is a significant portion of our sector, were suddenly like public narrative. Suddenly, like your neighbor knew what essential workplace was, right? And so to sort of start thinking about nonprofit workplaces and workers as essential workers in workplaces was also something new to us.
Right. Well, I know that ONN was very responsive to the crisis and initiated some important surveys related to the impact of the pandemic. Can you describe the most important findings in your perspective?
Yeah, for sure. We had a work plan, and then pandemic hit. It was like, okay, get rid of what we thought we were going to do, all hands on deck. And literally, I kid you not, Mary, it was, monitoring every single government announcement every moment of the day, and then doing that analysis. Okay, how is this going to impact our sector, the employers in our sector, and the workers in our sector? And so one way to sort of really figure out what was happening in our sector, because like I said, we're not, directly on the ground, was to do surveys. So we've actually done 3 sector-wide surveys over the course of the pandemic till now. The first one was 2 weeks into the pandemic, and this was more of a let's just figure out like what's happening now, like what do we need? What does the sector need? And what we found from there was that right off the bat, nonprofits were experiencing a triple threat. Decline in revenue, which was threatening their operations, increase in demand, and then human resources were suffering around that. We had about 500 organizations respond. 75% of them had abruptly lost revenue. Every part of the sector had been impacted. 73% were thinking about, office closures, cancellation of programs, that sort of thing. And 35% were seeing staff and volunteer absences. And this was early on in the pandemic. So it could have been due to, them themselves being impacted, someone in their family, or caregiving responsibilities. Schools had shut down. And so that was what we were sort of seeing then. 3 months in, we did another survey. This was like, I would say midsummer last year, to sort of assess, okay, now that we've had all these supports announced, how are the supports faring? Are they getting to our sector and their workers? And what we found from that was, the devastating economic impact continued, and the supports weren't helping. A lot of the supports were designed for the for-profit sector in mind, and we were either ad hoc or, we just didn't qualify. And so those supports weren't getting to the sector and our workers. And again, I talked about disproportionate impact. Really, we were continually seeing disproportionate impact on our arts and culture industry, sports and recreation, and our faith-based communities as well in the sector, that just had not pivoted like perhaps others had. And at that point, we also learned that, out of our respondents, which I think at this point was 1,100 for this survey, more than 3 in 10 had laid off staff. More than half had lost volunteers. So it's not, when it comes to our people in the sector, it's not just about the paid labor force, but also our volunteers who make up such a significant portion as well. And we're already sort of seeing that impact our sector. Another interesting piece was 30% did not anticipate being able to rehire staff. I'm really saying that rehiring was going to depend on how revenues rebounded, and what the demand for programming was, and what the sort of demand and expenses was. Because also to note, expenses were going up too. PPE, social distancing, having offices but not using offices, that sort of thing. And the last survey we did was just this summer. We just launched a report a couple weeks ago, and some of the same stuff was happening. I mean, a year into the pandemic, we're hearing the same things. more demand for services, revenue loss is continuing, federal and provincial supports are not helping. I mean, federal supports the wage subsidy and the rent subsidy were a bit more helpful, but like what was coming down from the provincial government was not helpful at all in Ontario, especially again for those disproportionately impacted. Um, yeah, so I mean, sort of just thinking through that, right? Like, we're probably going to end up doing another survey, but one thing I often think about is when nonprofits are suffering, so to speak, the workers are too, right? So if there's an increase in demand, there's not a lot of revenues, you can only imagine what the existing workforce is going through and the burnout that they might be experiencing, and just the whole trauma of having to hold it together, because we know a lot are like, if I don't do this work, some client or some community somewhere is going to be lacking in something, and
Right.
so yeah, those are some of the things we highlighted.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of paints the picture of the backdrop that so many of nonprofits and the professionals actually faced throughout this pandemic. And I think the unique thing that you mentioned as well is that sort of, in some instances, depending on the role, that kind of vicarious trauma they might have felt or experienced with their work that they do. Made even worse because of a shrinking workforce, taking on more responsibilities, doing it in circumstances that might feel unsafe for them. You're painting a picture of, a really seriously challenging sort of state for the nonprofit sector to be in for a very long, enduring period. The other thing I think is really worthwhile mentioning is that we know that the large number of individuals who are working in the nonprofit sector are women. And they may already be juggling their professional life with the demands of being a parent or a caregiver or other sorts of personal responsibilities. And, how has this exacerbated the nature and the depth of the mental health impacts on the sector when you take these other elements into consideration with that?
I mean, 80% of our workforce across the country are women workers in the nonprofit sector, right? So heavily women majority workforce, and we know in a lot of different subsectors, particularly Black women, other racialized women, women with disabilities, Indigenous women are concentrated in our sector, even though we might not have the data to back that up. And so, you're seeing so many pivots. You're seeing, well, then you have your essential workers who are every day, part of containing the pandemic, or doing, being on the front lines of serving those who might have come into contact with a contagion, whatever it might be, who might not be able to go home and see their families, right? We have others who are now working from home, like you had shared, that were not working from home before, and their kids are at home too, and their partners are maybe at home as well. So that triple burden that we heard often about is doing your work, doing the household work, and taking care of children. We know numerous studies had come out talking about that impact, particularly on women. And so, I mean, the mental health impacts, I think, are pretty clear, right? You get burnt out burnt out women, particularly, who are taking on a bulk of unpaid caregiving that perhaps they weren't doing before. And, organizations where expectations didn't change, that just adds on to that. And, again, I had shared, whatever happens to our organizations in the sector impacts our workers. Well, it particularly impacts women workers, right? So if you are decline in revenues, that means lower wages and, cuts to jobs, which hurts women. Or, if you're not able to pivot online and you need people to come in, and schools are closed and daycares are closed, how are women workers going to fare? And actually, we had a bunch of different provincial associations reach out to us about mid last summer saying, if schools don't open and daycares don't open, they're worried about their workers coming back to work, because most of them are women who are taking on that caregiving piece. I've been fortunate enough to be on a team that's very diverse, in the sense we do have moms on our team too. And I saw firsthand, right, so much work pressure because of the pandemic and so much going on, but also trying to manage, their homes and their children, and trying to sort of balance everything. And I was in awe every single day and seeing that happen. And so I can just imagine, in other organizations seeing that happen. And we're not essential service. We were working from home, which is a different story. But again, just to reiterate the point, right? Like, a lot of childcare is in our sector, home care, long-term care workers, personal support workers are all part of our sector. And we saw the devastating impact on them just via the work that they did.
That's right. And I think when we look at the other side, and I guess the scarcity of some solutions, particularly in the entire sort of experience of the pandemic, it's important to think about the workplace and the health of that workplace and, the structure of that workplace as it might support staff. ONN has done a great deal of work around its Decent Work initiative. Can you tell us about the project?
Yeah, for sure. So I've had the pleasure of working on this, which has, been both a project, a movement building, and a policy file for us. But it's really just decent work is a way in which to think about what good work is and why good work is important, right? It's a term coined by the International Labor Organization, which we sort of have borrowed. We've borrowed from them. And really, we've tried every sort of language and framework to start talking about the workforce issues we have in our sector, and decent work has resonated the most, right? And I think that's because there's this vision, it inspires vision for what we want good work to look like, and how to movement build around that, how to get people involved in that, but it also inspires action. It's not just, let's talk about why good work is important, but, how can we realistically make it a reality for people in our sector? And it's also values-based, which is why I think it also resonates with our sector, because a lot of our sector's work is values-based, right? It's about providing good work that's fair and stable, predictable, good wages, health and benefits, a pension plan, opportunities for professional development that don't necessarily come with a cost, a social or economic cost, right? That really pushing this idea and narrative that we actually all benefit from decent work, right? When as employees, we have decent work in this sector, we're going to excel at our jobs, we're happier and healthier, and we can sort of afford our cost of living and our quality of life improves. And then as employers, it works for them because they have dedicated workforce, a talented workforce that, can really meet the mission and mandates that the organization has put forth. More recently, we're also saying, it's good for funders. More sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? More advantage of the dollar that they're spending or they're investing. It's going to go a longer way without, turnovers, HR costs, etc. And it's better for communities. You have stronger organizations serving those communities because of a good workforce. And so the organizations are going to help build and contribute to thriving communities. So it's a win-win situation is what I like to say. And we saw that in the pandemic, organizations that had decent work practices built in, weathered better. A simple example is paid sick days. We saw how important and how big, paid sick days were during this time. And not just if you got sick, but if you needed to get tested, if your child got sick or needed to get tested. And, paid sick days were so important to have that paycheck during that time. And that's a decent work piece. So if organizations had that policy already, they didn't have to grapple with that. But then organizations that didn't had to sort of figure out, okay, like, how do I implement this on top of this global pandemic that's going on? And so, as we've moved forward and sort of done a lot of movement building around this, we particularly looked at what decent work looks like for the variety of workers in our sector with an intersectional lens, because decent work will mean different things for women workers, racialized workers in our sector, newcomers in our sector, which is really important to also consider.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you found that the initiative that you've been working on for some time was verified, in fact, from the experience that the nonprofit sector had during the pandemic. So how do you see the Decent Work Initiative through the lens of our recent experience with the pandemic and its impact on mental health in the workplace in particular?
It 100% mitigates it. It's the backbone, right? Like it's that idea. Well, it's, again, two piece. It's the vision that you have for your workplace, that you want a healthy, supported, space, workplace, and these are all the things. And then the actions piece. These are all the things you're going to do that are in your control or your power to be able to offer that and to we put people first, but we often as a sector put our communities first and not our workers first. And we're such a people-driven sector in the sense, our biggest asset is our workforce. And so if we can center them as well when we think about serving our communities, decent work is a way to do that. And it really does mitigate the impact on mental health in the workplace. If there's fair wages, there's not that constant stress of am I going to be able to make rent, right? We heard so many stories of childcare workers, and childcare was not supported during the pandemic by any sort of means, who could didn't have work anymore, or even if they did, couldn't even afford to put their own children in daycare, the ones that they were working for, and so it's just fair wages is so important in that way. Health and dental benefits, right? A pension plan. Women live longer, retire, but are more likely to retire into poverty because of the gender wage gap. So as a sector, 80% women, if we can offer them a stable pension plan, a retirement plan, think about the possibilities there. And those are all like fair wages, health benefits, stability, paid sick days are some of those big pieces. But one of the things that was really highlighted, not just at ONN, but generally I would say in the nonprofit sector, that it has become so important to decent work and work-life balance in any way, is the flexibility of workplaces, and this idea that you don't have to be in the office to know that you're doing work. This idea that you don't have to work 9 to 5 to be productive. This idea that if today's not a good day and you're just not getting stuff done because there's so much going on and the world is sort of ending, that you can take time to step away, right? And as ONN, we're a learning organization, and decent work, we try to walk the talk, of course, but I would say like one of the biggest learnings for us is it's okay to say no, it's okay to slow down, it's okay if people need to step away for a bit and just catch their breath, really providing that true essence of work-life balance, because there was definitely no boundary for work and life and personal life when it came to the pandemic. It was all within, whether 500 square feet you live in or 3,000 square feet.
Well, you've mentioned the different kinds of nonprofit organizations and the different roles, and I think that's really important when we address what may be practical steps that leaders of nonprofit organizations can take to support their people, because what might be available to a small nonprofit is entirely different than what may be available to a larger one. Can you walk us through some practical ideas or advice that you would have for both of those different kinds of organizations, if you had any advice to give to their leaders?
Yes, lots of advice. And I think I'll start off by saying that, decent work is a journey. No one is expecting you, big or small organization, to come in and have everything laid out, right? Like it takes time, and some of our organizations are so old and built on such, archaic notions of what work used to be. Or some of our organizations are brand new and maybe just came up as a response to a community need. So HR wasn't even a focus at any, you know what I mean? So just recognizing that wherever you end up starting is okay, as long as you're taking, the low hanging fruit, or starting small, or doing whatever you can, and building upon it over time, because then it'll become culture. It'll become normal for you to do. The second piece is that often, I heard so many sector organizations say, I want to do this, but I don't have the money, so I'm just not going to explore it. A lot of decent work practices may not end up costing money, right? And a simple example I share with that is ONN was, looking at its health and dental benefit plans a year or so ago, and really from the team, what we wanted to see was mental health supports covered under our health and benefits plan, which at that point weren't, right? And so the idea was, it's going to just cost more money. We're not going to have any room in our budget for that. But actually our ED, Kathy Taylor, just talked to the company and said, hey, this is what we're looking for. Like, can you offer this to us? And it actually ended up being cheaper than what we were paying already. And so just, pieces like that, instead of shutting down some of those decent work practices, but exploring them and not assuming that they're going to cost so much money in the now. And on the flip side, it might cost money now, but think about what you're going to be saving on turnover, on HR costs, in lost productivity, in turnovers, in loss of funding dollars if you're someone who gets funding, right? And just how much it's going to impact your mission, especially again if the labor force is our biggest asset. So those are some high level things I would definitely encourage everyone to keep in mind. And at ONN we've developed a decent work charter. We have a decent work checklist that organizations can use, and we also have a guide to implement equitable compensation practices, because let's face it, fair wages are one of the top indicators that the workforce in our sector talks about. And again, they're all written from the perspective of a small organization or a big one, an arts, culture, industry, or organization, or a massive social service delivery partner, right? There's just so much diversity, and we've sort of taken account for that. And so just thinking about all the different indicators of fair wages, health and benefits, stable employment, professional advancement, culture and leadership, there's a lot there that can be done that doesn't require a lot of funding or a lot of money. It's more, how do you inspire that culture of decent work in your organization and then take steps to implement it over time, whether that's with your board, the ED, senior management, and staff. I think in the culture of now, what we would love to see is equitable pay, equal pay for equal work for equal work of equal value, particularly for women workers in our sector. Pay transparency, right? If you're posting jobs, make sure you're posting job ranges. Health and dental benefit plans. ONN recently endorsed a pension plan, which is a 3+3 contribution rate, and it's a defined benefit plan. Another piece that you can organizations can join. And I guess I'll leave you with where I aspire us to be as decent work employers in a sector, is I'm working on a benefit plan for parental leave benefit top-ups. So, whenever someone takes leave, whether that's maternity or parental leave, when they have new children, or adoption leave, EI might cover, a certain percentage of your earnings per week, which is about 55. And I'm working on an insurance plan for the sector where organizations can join, pay a premium, and then whenever someone takes leave from their organization, maternity, parental, adoption, they can get a top-up up to 80% of their earnings, and what a difference that would make, and really hoping that it could be accessible to those that don't qualify for EI either. So these are all the initiatives, dream big, aspire big, and start somewhere.
And you've got a lot of resources on your website as well that are available to organizations and professionals. Maybe you could just mention a couple of them, especially around, coping with the pandemic, or issues around decent work and supporting staff. What kind of resources have you got?
Yeah, so www.theonn.ca, go down to resources and you'll see everything posted there. We have everything from, the pandemic related, do you need a vaccination policy? What kind of PPE or return to work policies are you looking for? All our survey reports are up there to influence the way in which you go forward in planning opening of nonprofits. We also have all our decent work resources, the charter, the checklist, the compensation checklist, as well as 121 ideas. You can pick up something to implement in your organization for decent work. We also have a resource center, the nonprofit resource center, which is linked on our website, which has more of the nitty gritty, like different HR policies, but even looking at how do you do land acknowledgements, implementing anti-racism work in your organization. So that's a bit more broad. AGM, how to run virtual AGMs in this climate. That's definitely there as well. And our blog is also a source of knowledge, maybe not in the traditional sense, but we've posted a lot of stuff over the year about just the impact on our sector, on our workforce, and how decent work and investing in decent work can really, really help the sector, come through on the other side.
So just a huge amount of resources. Thank you so much. That'll be really valuable to a lot of organizations and professionals in the sector. I wanted to kind of have you turn slightly to a different angle and look at, even during this painful and challenging time that we've gone through with the pandemic, are there any potential changes or lessons that we've learned as a result of it that could be viewed as positive for the sector as we look to the future of work?
Right. Yeah. I mean, another one of my policy buckets. I think first and foremost, we just have to recognize how resilient the sector is, right? Immediate shutdowns, loss of revenues, accelerated digitization and pivoting to online and continuing to serve communities. And we did it. Like we actually did that as a sector, not just in Ontario, but across the country, and continue to serve our communities when they were facing, some of the hardest days they've seen. So just kudos to the sector in that. And, I guess the learning there is that when push comes to shove, like we'll show up, and we'll not only show up, but we'll, do what needs to get done. And so that's just been amazing to see. The other thing that I've been reading and writing and thinking about a lot is how technological disruption is going to impact our sector. There was a lot of us who said, I want to do this online, but it's just not the time. It's not, we don't have the resources. We don't know how to do it. We don't have someone on staff who knows how to do it. But the amount of organizations, regardless if they're a frontline or not, that transition to online work, that transition to using technology in such different ways in their work has been astonishing, right? Over the past 18 months. So, the sector is not scared of technology, and we can implement technology, and there's so many different ways to implement technology. And if I could leave the, listeners with anything, is really think about technological disruption not sort of eradicating our sector, that we're actually pretty future of work proof. A lot of the work that we do in our sector, regardless of what subsector you're in, requires human to human contact or human to human connection, or the skills that come from humans, complex problem solving, judgment, that sort of piece. Robots are not going to be able to do that. AI is not going to be able to do that. So our jobs are there. It's just a matter of how can we use technology to make our jobs better and to serve our communities better. And so ONN is very interested in this, very focused on this, and we'll be exploring this as the months go by. I encourage you to keep a watch out on our website for some updates around that.
Thank you, Pam, for all your valuable insights and your passion for the sector, which comes through so very clearly. Thanks for your time.